Hey there, my friends. So I have a little sort of video series I think I'm going to start. I think it's going to be a series. We'll see how it goes. So here's a little intro, and then I'll do this little intro, and then I'll turn it down, and we'll go through the steps that I'm going to talk about. So, shadow work is something that I have some experience with. I was a big fan of this book, which is now really hard to get, evidently. This is Tarot Shadow Work by Christine Jetty, and she's one of the great tarot writers. I know this is out of print. I know it's hard to find in some places. All I would say about that is, like, write to Llewellyn and write to the author. I don't really know much about the author, but sometimes if crowds of people ask for enough things, the publishers will go for it. And, who knows? Maybe the author would be willing to do a self-published ebook or something. Who knows? Anyway, that's not the point of the video. The point of the video is shadow work, right? Now, we tend to think of shadow work as an individual healing process, but I think one of the, I'm going to be like, as I always am, I'm just going to be totally honest with folks. Feel free to disagree with me, but when something I say pings disagreement, then actually that's kind of part of the series we're going to talk about anyway. So one of the things that can happen, I think, for those of us in the New Age community, tarot community, spiritual community, is that we can get very focused on the self and on healing ourself, which is important. But there is a universal shadow out there in the world, and I think sometimes we can get so focused on the internal that we forget the external, and that the choices we make and the things we do and say contribute to the universal shadow. And what is the universal shadow? Well, it's anything that's hard to face about the world. So when we're thinking about the universal shadow, we're thinking about racism and bigotry and bias. We're thinking about war. We're thinking about pollution. We're thinking about income inequality. We're thinking about all the things that we as folks in this, this broader spiritual community of sort of non-traditional, I guess I'll use, thinkers, both recognize as unfortunate and bad and shadow, but that we don't necessarily feel like we can contribute to the solution of, or sometimes we get overwhelmed by it, or sometimes we just don't think about it because we're very centered in here. And that's okay. I mean, obviously we have to take care of this, because without that we can't contribute to the outer landscape. We can't contribute to the outer world, right? Great. But once we do that work, or while we're doing that work, we do want to think about how we contribute to that universal shadow. And so what I'm going to propose in the next couple of videos is just a series of spreads that you can do yourself, and you can adapt them if you want to. And the first one is going to focus on unconscious bias. And this is going to be probably one of the more difficult ones we'll do, because unconscious bias is unconscious, which means that if it were going to come to the surface easily, it would have. Unconscious bias is essentially those things that we've learned, internalized, been taught, make up our constitution, that make it difficult for us to see how we contribute to the marginalization, the disenfranchisement of others. Sometimes not sometimes, I mean many times, a lot of the way we contribute to the universal shadow is by doing nothing, or doing what we've always done, is our dedication to the status quo. I'm going to give you an example and say, when I was a kid, so here's an example, right? When I was a kid, one of my favorite books was The Secret Garden. Loved it. I read it left, right, and center, right? Read it over and over again. When I was in my early teens, I think, or late, 11, 12, I can't remember the year. But there was a Broadway musical, The Secret Garden, which is beautiful, and that came out and was incredible, and that just internalized my love for it. And I remember having a conversation with a friend, and I was talking about how much I loved that book, and she said, that book is really racist. That book is really problematic. I can't believe you like that. And I said, no, what? No. It's just, it was written in a different time, that's, yeah, it's probably problematic, but, I mean, we can't hold ourselves to that standard, or those writers to our current standards, right? And I got really defensive about it, and I said, I don't want to, and because it was a conversation that was getting really uncomfortable, and I said, okay, I don't want to talk about this anymore. That's a moment of unconscious bias, because I had internalized the lesson that it was okay. Now, you're going to disagree with me. Probably many people are going to disagree with me, but this is just an example. I was taught and believed and internalized that it's fine. Those things are fine for us to put out, to engage with. And to a degree, they are, right? We can't ignore the work of the past, but we also can't defend it. And I got really defensive and I got really hurt. It wasn't until years later when I went actually and reread the book and I said, oh, yeah, this is really racist, that I was able to sort of hear what that person was saying. But my unconscious bias, which was in favor of something that I loved in my childhood, got in the way of my hearing that the book supports really problematic depictions of folks from India and other locations, and uses language that, frankly, I wouldn't want, if I had children, I wouldn't want them introduced to it in that way. Now, I can't solve for everyone the problem of what I do, what you do with the secret garden, for example. I can't solve that for you. But what I can do is suggest how we face the shadow of unconscious bias. All right. What I chose to do is to, I'm not in a position to do anything with the secret garden anyway. I treasure the magic that it gave to me as a child, and I'm able to now look at it and say, yeah, this is full of really biased, really racist depictions of people, and that's not okay. And that if I'm going to introduce this story to someone, now I'm not a parent, but suppose I were a teacher, I would have to engage in a conversation about why, what the world was like at that time, what it's like now, what's changed and what hasn't. But that's a different part of the problem. The thing that we're looking at is we're facing our shadow. And the first shadow we're going to face, if you're willing to do this, is unconscious bias. So I've designed a spread for you. It's, my version of a spread anyway. I'm going to do this for myself, and I'm going to take pictures of the spread. Now, this isn't a spread you just lay out and go, oh, great. This is something you work with. This is something you sit with, because it's not going to be easy, especially the first two positions in the spread. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go lay out the spread on my table. I'm going to really work with it. I'm going to put it into the PowerPoint and come back and talk you through both the spread and my example of it. I think that if you're willing to engage in this is a specific kind of shadow work that is needed in the world right now, and it's something that I think can be a really interesting thing as a community to engage in. And so I would encourage you to share. What I would also, though, so you can, I'm perfectly happy to see, I would love to see video responses to this. What I would love you to do, though, too, is just remember that in dealing with this kind of thing, it's both vulnerable. It does require us looking deep into the darker part of who we are, the parts of ourselves we don't like, the parts that need healing. So maybe this isn't something you want to necessarily do live. Another thing I would say, too, is to think about the consequence of the things you're saying in a response to this. So can what you do or say as you experience this conversation with yourself and with the cards about unconscious bias trigger someone else? And so what I would recommend doing, rather than sort of doing a live experience of your reading, is going through the reading and sharing highlights with folks if you want to make a response video, so that you're able to talk about your experience and whether it was a transformative moment to whatever degree, without saying anything that will hurt someone. Because, of course, whatever we put out into the world has consequences, right? So that's what I would say about that. But I do think it's a conversation that's worth engaging. And so I'm gonna sort of put like a trigger warning here and say that I'm gonna be as honest as I can be as a human being, full of unconscious bias with my reading, and it may trigger someone. But I want to ask for forgiveness in addition to that, just as a way of illustrating how to engage this process, right? I probably will not go through everything as deeply as I experienced it, because of course it's important that I really dig deep. And so there are things maybe I won't feel comfortable sharing, and that's okay too. But I want to give you an experience of what this looks like, right? So let me go ahead and pause this. I'll do the reading, and then I'll walk you through both the spread and how to work with it. All right? See you in a sec. So in this little example, I think it's worth knowing that I'm defining unconscious bias probably a little more broadly than they might in the workplace, for example, if you've taken unconscious bias training. But what I'm really asking us to look at is some part of ourself that has a prejudice, that has a bias, that we're not really aware of, and that bringing it to the fore can help us explore. All right. So here's how the spread works. Now, I use 3 cards for each position, as you'll see. So I don't use just one card, but you can just use one card. I find that for something like this, actually, even if you don't normally use 3 cards, you might want to, because the more context you have, the easier it will be for you to analyze, as you'll see. But the first position is essentially show me one of my unconscious biases. And that's going to be the hardest of the bunch to sit with and incorporate, because if it were easy to bring to the surface, if it were easy to know what those things are, we would know them already. So it does require some sitting and struggling with, and I think that the real work is in this first one. The others will probably be fairly easy. So that's the first one. The second one is show me how this bias impacts others. And by others, I mean that universal shadow, that world at large. How is my unconscious bias negatively hurting people? The third one is a proactive set. Show me one way I can counteract this bias. So just one thing I can do to start undoing the damage that my unconscious bias is doing for others. And then finally, a thing that I really like to do in a lot of readings is show me one way I can check my progress. So as I'm doing the work of this, how do I know that I'm actually making progress towards it? And mine was pretty interesting. Now, I shuffled and drew for each one. So I drew the first one, did the work on that, put everything back in the deck, reshuffled, drew the second, etc. So you'll actually see a repeat card here, and that's actually why I like to do that in a spread like this. So I actually reshuffled several, after each one or before each one. And repeat cards in this case can actually be really telling. So I recommend that in this case. All right. So the first one, of course, is show me my unconscious bias. And again, this is not easy. Oh, I should say too, this is the World Spirit deck by Lauren O'Leary and Jessica Godino. This is the first edition, but the second edition is out and available. So, show me one of my unconscious biases. And again, this is not easy. And how you go about this really depends on what kind of reader you are, etc. But you'll see why I found that 3 cards was really helpful to me here. So the middle card really was the one that jumped out to me, just visually. I saw immediately that my unconscious bias has to do with poverty, with folks who are homeless, with homelessness, which is a big problem. And even as I was saying this, I recognized that every time I go to, literally pull out of my apartment's parking lot and go down to the intersection, there's always 1 or 2 people on the corner collecting money. I mean, all year. And homelessness is a big problem everywhere. And like most folks, I like to sweep it under the rug, right? There but for the grace, right? So it was sort of a moment of oh, shit, Like I say I care about these things, and I do, but then I look at the 4 of Cups, and to me, the just generalized apathy of that card comes screaming out. It's it's there, you care, but you're not doing anything about it, and you don't really care enough to not be ultimately very apathetic about it. And then with the Sybil of Wands, there was a real sort of gut check there, which was just looking at wands as an act of attention. So what I gathered from this spread of 3 was a performative caring about poverty, right? A performative element that I am generally And these things are hard to say. It's hard to like admit these things, right? And it's like, but it's true. It's like I am generally aware of poverty, of homelessness, of the struggle. I have certainly lived it in my younger days, and who knows? We could all be living it again. I know it's there. I say I care about it, but I generally don't really take a whole lot of action on it. And when I do, it's often to make myself look good or feel good. And so the unconscious bias there is towards the issue of poverty, of homelessness, especially as we head into a polar vortex here in the United States. I mean, it's going to be unlivably cold in some parts of the country right now. And, it rings a bell. It's like, it's not fun to say these things. But it's there. And I asked, right? And Tara will always answer the question we ask. So there's the unconscious bias that is worth my facing right now. All right. So the second set of 3 is how does this impact the world at large? And in a weird way, as soon as you do the first one, you kind of get the immediate, what you're dealing with, what the results are. But again, it's sort of interesting to sit with them. And this 6 of Wands, again, is a really difficult and embarrassing and hard thing to explore, because it's like you throw yourself a parade while people are out there alone and they're suffering. So you feel good about yourself when you take any action. You'll allow yourself to be celebrated for it, but there are people out there alone, with the hermit out there in the world trying to survive, and they're suffering, and they're, out there suffering alone while you're patting yourself on the back. So that's the consequence of this particular unconscious bias. Now, ideally, or theoretically, a conscious bias, right? Because we brought the conscious out. So then the next part of the reading is to explore what's one thing I can do to counteract that. Now, I'm going pretty quickly here. It's important to know that one of the reasons why I didn't just do this live is because I needed to sit and really, I really sort of sketched out in my notebook, like, what does this mean? So I did all of this sort of privately, and I'm just sharing with you the highlights so you get a sense of, what this sounds like, and how, and how you might explore within the context of the reading how this goes, right? But so this was not a 5-minute activity. So the next one, of course, is what can I do to counteract that? And the High Priestess here is interesting. It's like I usually talk about the High Priestess as withholding, as mystery. I think the High Priestess here is, look, dummy, it's not a mystery. You got to do the work of putting your money out into the world, of putting your money where your mouth is, essentially, and being disciplined with the Hierophant, being disciplined and actually dedicating yourself to that cause if you really want to make an impact. The other thing that I took away from the Eight of Pentacles actually was something very, very specific, which isn't always what we get out of readings, which is how the idea of volunteering for skills training. Because, of course, I work in training, right? So, is there an opportunity out there for me to work with folks who are unemployed or underemployed to do skills training with them? Now, it's a funny thing, right? Because my instant reaction as a human with a full-time job and a tarot practice and a playwriting career is like, I don't know that I have time for that. But it's like, look, fucker, you asked. And that's one of the things that we face when we do this kind of work is like, what's my reaction to each of these? And if I have a reaction of like, well, I don't know, it's a lot of work, then like, you asked, you know what I mean? Like, you're the one who asked. No one forced you to see this. So if you really want to make a difference, there's got to be a sacrifice somewhere. You've got to have the discipline. You've got to dedicate yourself to it with that Hierophant card. All right, so not easy, right? This work isn't easy, but I think that in terms of like the universal shadow, the social shadow, it's worth exploring. Now, I have an easy way out, which is to just throw money at the problem, which would help. I mean, money in the case of poverty helps, but there's probably more I could do. And if I'm really willing to do it, if I'm willing to go into that deeper mystery of the High Priestess, then I could do more. And then the fourth one is something I really like to do with a lot of readings: is how do I check my progress? And the reason that I like that is because we are going to feel like sometimes we're making progress, and sometimes we're going to feel like we're not making progress, and sometimes we're going to feel like we're stuck. How do I know? Well, here's where that second, or where card reappeared. It was the Hermit, and in the first place it appeared was in the consequences section of the reading. And it appeared to me as someone being all alone out there. And look at the sort of trajectory of the Hermit into the Five of Cups. Well, here the Hermit moves into the Sun. And I look at this spread and I say, how do I check my progress? Well, if any one of those people out there who's out there alone is in from the cold with the sun, is able to fend off the cold with those burning wands in the Seven of Wands, then you're making a difference. You're affecting change in that area. And if not, then you're not making progress. So that's my reading, and it's really uncomfortable, and it's not fun to share in public. Because it's true, and I mean, I only share this because I know, like I said in the intro at the beginning, we all have these. We all have things we could be working towards, and they're often very simple ways to face it. But I do believe that if, as a spiritual community, as a tarot community, as a New Age community, etc., we are truly interested in shadow work, then it needs to go beyond just our own individual healing, which is important. Again, I do believe we can't help others unless we can help ourselves, right? But I think really truly that in order to venture into shadow work, that means exploring beyond ourselves, exploring how ourselves, our individualities, contribute to the larger shadow and light in the world. So I would encourage folks to try this. Again, if you want to share your experience, I'd love to hear it. And just be, I guess my request again, as I said at the beginning in the intro, is just, what you put out there, be thoughtful about what it might do to others, but this should be an act of generosity. It should not, I guess, be an act of self-affirmation. The risk with doing anything like this and sharing this is the sense of this right here. You know what I mean? Of this... the Six of Wands, that sense of like, yay, look at me, I'm doing something good, I'm doing something hard. That's not what it's about. It's not about celebrating ourselves for facing hard truths. It's about sharing the need to face those hard truths with each other and engaging in a dialogue about how we face those with each other, not about celebrating ourselves for doing something difficult. Because in this reading, even the most difficult thing that I could possibly face is relatively easy in comparison to standing out in the freezing cold, hoping someone gives me $1 for a cup of coffee, and it's so easy for me to be like, yay, I care. That's not what this is, though. This is an example of how do I face those shadows that I'm contributing to. So, as always, I hope this is interesting. I think I have a couple more ideas for other conversations and spreads around this particular kind of universal shadow. And I do hope you give it a try, and I do hope you have a really honest and open experience with it. So be well, and we'll talk soon.